I've said this before, but the world is full of narcissistic cults, all with their own victims and virtues. In the era of coronavirus, professional victims and other attention seekers compete for our sympathy and resources, offering almost nothing in return. Life in lockdown feels strange and different. Somehow, we know that our priorities have changed. We have to get back to basics. But nobody knows what it all means. All I can offer you is a metaphor. To borrow a term from immunology, COVID-19 is an adjuvant to the malaise of 21st century civilization. It's a complication of a serious underlying illness. The coronavirus thrives on our cultural narcissism, our arrogance, our lies, our moral weakness, and our misplaced faith. Tragically, any lessons we learn from this awful time will come at the price of thousands, if not millions, of preventable deaths. With consummate cruelty, this pandemic not only shows us who we are, but it also offers a glimpse of what might become of us, the first truly global civilization. Psychologists tell us that all narcissistic relationships obey a very distinct pattern: idealization, devaluation, and, finally, when the narcissist has extracted everything they can from the other person, the final discard. Civilizations follow a similar pattern that is not completely unlike a relationship involving a narcissist. In the early stages, a civilization blossoms, and then, in love with its own ideals, it proceeds to conquer other cultures, as if by destiny, or perhaps some kind of magnetism. Then, over the course of time, civilization begins to question or devalue itself, and the slow process of degeneration leads to a protracted and cynical collapse. The rise and fall of civilizations is an interesting and leafy branch of history. Western historians make a very nice living saying that civilization is in decline, even if they are a little shaky about the exact timing and scale of the decline. For an example of this school of thought, look no further than the British historian Niall Ferguson, whose 2014 book, The Great Degeneration, argues that all major institutions in the West are in freefall. Further back, Oswald Spengler's epic The Decline of the West said something similar, although that book was published in 1918, quite some time before the onset of the West's actual decline. In Ferguson's book, there are 4 peculiarly Western institutions that are in decline: democracy, capitalism, the rule of law, and civil society. Although democracy still has a rather faint pulse, and capitalism isn't going to die off anytime soon, it is obvious that in Western countries there has been a withering away of civil society and the rule of law. This institutional decline is everywhere, as people outsource their personal responsibilities to an ever-growing government in exchange for their freedoms. Naturally, the end of self-reliance and unquestioning obedience to our bureaucratic overlords has sapped the vigour of our civilization as we indulge our delusions of certainty in an uncertain world. In Spengler's book, The Decline of the West, civilization is an organism. It is not divided into artificial historical epochs like the Babylonian or Roman eras, and he argues that all civilizations experience 1,000-year periods of ascension and decline before their extinction. Despite some of Spengler's rather odd ideas, his analogy of culture as a living thing is interesting. Looking at culture like an organism suggests that it is vulnerable to sickness. Our body politic faces threats from the outside, like a virus or a parasite, and from the inside, like a genetic problem or susceptibility to a particular disease, like diabetes. Spengler lived in an era when very little was known about the causes of disease, but his analogy begs some useful questions. Can we find the cause of our disease? How is it transmitted? Can it be treated? Or can we vaccinate ourselves against it? Like any virus, societal narcissism always has the same basic structure, but it adapts to its local environment. Like a mutating virus, narcissism binds itself to the vulnerable points in its host organism. There are many other examples of narcissistic cults in the world today, but let's take a mind virus that is particularly lethal in Western culture: socialism. But I hear you say, why should we equate socialism with narcissism? Surely socialists are only trying to build a fairer, more equal world and liberate people from oppression. That's good, right? It certainly sounds good, unless you are familiar with narcissists. They are the kind of people who see responsibility as oppression, and to them, destroying their enemies is fairness. The foremost figure in history's most successful narcissistic cult was, of course, Karl Marx himself. Marx, born in Germany in 1818, was an ambitious but unhappy young man. In one early essay, he wrote bizarrely about his demon of ambition and how he wanted to inveigh against the deity and curse mankind. As a rakish youth, Marx wrote a lot of pretentious and rather creepy poetry, envisioning himself as a godlike figure, enthroned in agony and served by machine-like workers. Marx's later life ticked a lot of boxes for narcissism, if not outright sociopathy. On one occasion, he got his housekeeper pregnant and threw her out on the street. Several of his destitute children starved to death. Despite this, Marx never dirtied his hands with real work, preferring to live in a state of domestic parasitism with his wealthy friend and fellow communist, Friedrich Engels. Marx's loyal wife, Jenny von Westphalen, was a German aristocrat, and both she and her family were quite taken in by Marx's considerable charm. In his professional career, if you can call it that, Marx insinuated himself into every revolutionary movement he could find, before eventually winding up as European correspondent for the New York Daily Tribune. Marx's life is the model for every self-hating bourgeois intellectual. But surely Marx's life doesn't tell us anything about his ideology. Let's look at that in the context of its times. Marxism is a mirror image of the industrialized Christian society which it infected, rather like an alternative religion, but for narcissists. Unlike most people, but not unlike Jesus Christ, Marxists venerate poverty. They also have their own weird Bible stories. Like the Christian origin story of the Garden of Eden, the foundational myth of Marxism is primitive communism, an idealized, egalitarian, hunter-gatherer society. The idea of the workers' paradise is, of course, the materialists' idea of heaven, and there is a cathartic Armageddon story in the shape of the revolution. These days, Marxism is our church, complete with saints like Che Guevara, hymns like the Red Flag, ritual self-flagellation on the internet, and the kind of congregation that most churches can only dream about. But when you point all this out, Marxists will gaslight you by telling you that you are simply suffering from alienation. Rather like God, only a Marxist really knows what you're thinking. Of course, all narcissists suffer from delusions of omniscience. Since Marx's death, socialists have weaponized the socialist mind virus for Western liberal societies, notably led by French postmodernists and then American activists, such as the 1970s community organizer Saul Alinsky. Alinsky's book, Rules for Radicals, is the perfect expression of narcissistic, the ends justify the means kind of thinking, and Alinsky even admitted that having a constructive solution would be a disaster for any subversive worth the name. Proving once again that nothing good ever came out of France, the postmodernists championed the deconstruction of Western values and its great literature. Deconstruction is, of course, destruction of Western values, and it undermines our ability to make sense of anything at all. Postmodernism is a rejection of the Enlightenment values of logic and reason, which made Western culture so extraordinarily successful at its apex. Today, these perverse and unscientific neo-Marxist ideas are alive and well, at the pinnacles of what passes for our mainstream culture. In the Western world in 2020, the narcissism virus is thriving. We have become uncoupled from reality, shuffling ones and zeros while COVID-19 sets the world on fire. Like narcissists whose ego is under threat, our governments are throwing their weight around and holding everyone else responsible. But the malaise goes deeper than any temporary restriction to our liberties. In the West, our institutions have lost their purpose because narcissism thrives in lazy times. We have universities who get their students into a lifetime of debt, usually in return for a useless qualification, such as economics or social science. We have Christian churches that spout Marxist buzzwords, bureaucrats who engineer our lives but do not serve our needs, corporations which do not make anything, and banks that do not pay interest. This is to say nothing of the legacy media, which neither investigates news stories nor reflects the views of the public at large. So, in our morally and financially bankrupt corona world, can we identify narcissists and sociopaths who are a luxury that we can no longer afford? Should we simply get it over with and exterminate the communist bourgeoisie? However satisfying that might be, it's a terrible idea. One of the failures of Marxism is its misunderstanding of the concept of value, and there are other lessons that we can learn. The dangers of purges, or what happens if you exclude whole groups of people based on their opinions or personal characteristics. Perhaps, after this epidemic, we could have a truth and reconciliation process for narcissists, a bit like denazification in post-World War II Germany. But if narcissism is a trait that we all share, who will judge what degree of narcissism is dangerous for the rest of us, and who will enforce those standards? Or maybe we should just let market forces decide who has value and who does not. Probably not, when capitalism itself has been rigged for the sociopaths. Or perhaps we humble taxpayers should simply refuse to pay for socially unnecessary narcissists. That will be difficult when they are the ones in charge. Or we could just let everything collapse and let the preppers have their fun. Surely, something must be done. The unpleasant truth is that narcissism is incurable. No border wall ever stopped a narcissist from entering the country. Even if our world looks radically different after the coronavirus, the struggle against narcissism will continue, because the narcissism virus is inherent in all of us, and it's a struggle with ourselves. We can certainly expect narcissists to interfere with this healthy process. In the meantime, I hope you stay well. You can vaccinate yourself against narcissism by liking this video and subscribing to this channel. Just one final disclaimer: some vaccines don't work for everyone.